So let's think a little bit more about this whole idea of the Posek, y'all. So what we have is Jesus has told Peter that he will be one who has powers of binding and loosing. Okay, so that's when he made the confession of Jesus as the incarnate Son of God. So it's based on that confession that Jesus says you will be the one who binds and looses. We see at the day of the resurrection on Easter evening when Jesus shows up, he breathes on the disciples and said that whatever you forgive will be forgiven in heaven. Whatever you don't forgive on earth won't be forgiven in heaven. That's binding and loosing. That's determining whether something is sin or not, whether it needs to be repented of, whether it needs to be changed. So, so they're all given that opportunity. But at the end of John's gospel, you see John and Peter on the beach, and Jesus walking with them. John's walking behind, and Jesus commissions Peter, and only Peter, by giving him keys to the kingdom. Essentially, he says, "Feed my sheep," and then he asks, "Do you love me more than these?" And that becomes the basis for Peter receiving that commission. Now, it was exercised, and we're going to look at this tomorrow a little bit, but it was exercised, the authority to bind and loose was exercised by the apostles themselves, all of them. And when we see it, when they meet, Peter uses it, in one place, and then they all come together and decide the Gentile question. We'll look at that tomorrow. But what I want to get at is this. So what is it? What's required to be that person? And how does Jesus become the one who says you're going to do that? Because normally what happens is in Judaism, that's something that's collectively decided by the rabbis, the Sanhedrin, the leaders. They decide these are the people that we believe are the most learned men, and that they will then become the people who will guide us in interpretation. Now, if you remember in Acts, one of the things that the rabbis of the Sanhedrin notice is these are unlearned men. They're men who've been with Jesus, but they're not learned men. In other words, they didn't go to the best rabbinic schools. They weren't taught in the way that other expert rabbis were. Now, Paul is an exception to that rule because Paul was trained up under one of the great rabbis, but none of the disciples were. I mean, you remember these guys are fishermen and tax collectors and whatever. And so it's unusual, one thing, that Jesus would say, you're going to be that person. And then it's really unusual in the sense that who is he to make that determination? Well, I believe that he's essentially a new Moses, leading a new Exodus. And so he's going to lead his people out. So some of his people are going to come out of Judaism into this new thing called Christianity. The ones who believe in him as the incarnate Son of God are those people. And then others will stay behind. But then he'll also lead others out of other belief systems and pull together a new family under a new covenant. Doesn't mean that the Jews are no longer God's covenant people. I didn't say that, don't mean that, would never say that. They are always God's covenant people because God is the one who made the covenant. Therefore, it's an everlasting covenant. It's based on his faithfulness, not theirs. So now in that covenant, you get these people raised up within the community. Jesus says, all right, in the beginning here, I've got to raise them up myself. In the same way God raised up Moses, and in the same way God raised up the others that he put his spirit on in numbers to help Moses with the work. So Jesus says, I'm going to give this to you. You got to name somebody up front in the same way God named Moses. But then he pours it out on the 12 who represent the 12 tribes of Israel. These are the 12 new tribes of the new covenant. So they each get a measure of the Spirit, and now here we go. And so, but the thing is that where does all this go back to? What does it relate to? It relates completely back to Jesus' conversation with Nicodemus when he says you got to be born of water and the Spirit. You can't understand these things that I'm telling you unless you're born of water and the Spirit. And so what he's saying is, Peter, flesh and blood didn't reveal this to you, but my Father who's in heaven. In other words, the Holy Spirit revealed it to him. And so on the day of Pentecost, Peter's the one who gives the message. He's the one who preaches. But it relates back to Jesus' conversation with Nicodemus, who was probably himself a Posek. So now you get Peter moving into that role, even though he's not a quote learned man in that he didn't go to the best schools. He did, however, go to the best school. He went to school with Jesus as his rabbi, but then he was given the Holy Spirit to guide him into all truth. And so that's how come Peter can be that first one to exercise that role. And then it's his job to train up others who can carry on the work behind him and after him.